welcome everyone to the MEDICI Inner Circle live event. Thank you all for taking the time on a weekend, and thank you, Matt, for being here on a weekend.
Happy to do it.
This is the first in a series. The idea here was to use our extra weekend time wisely, and especially in these special times, we have a little bit more time to reflect, to learn, and to think about how we can get ready when things do get back to normal. And I couldn't be happier to start this series off than with Matt Harris of Bain Capital Ventures. Matt needs no introduction. I can say a lot about Matt, and Matt can say a lot about himself, but I want to simply thank him and jump right in. And we are going to focus today's conversation. And the series here is really to talk about VC in fintech, and we will try to debunk and demystify some of the myths around venture capital in general. Just a quick destination check. If you're looking for the latest research or trends or insights, we could talk about it, but that's not what we'll talk about in this conversation. Wrong number, wrong flight. We will talk about leadership. We will talk about the relationship between investors and founders. That is the focus. And let me start with the obvious question, the cliche, which is that investors invest in people, not businesses. Matt, is that a cliche or is that true?
We find that to be true. And I mean, there are degrees of it, but if you think about the sort of platonic ideal of a early stage venture capital investment, there isn't much else to bet on other than the people. You have little in the way of, economic traction to point to. You generally don't have a complete product. So your choices are, you can bet on a market or you can bet on a team. There are some firms who specialize in betting on markets. And those firms acknowledge often that they have to replace teams as they go. But our strategy has been to bet on teams, and we view it as somewhat of a failure if we have to make changes to the team along the way. Our hope when we make an early stage investment is that we've got the team that can build this company with many additions to the team, of course, through to a multi-billion-dollar result.
Is that more true in an earlier phase of the investment? I mean, you have seen kind of the whole gamut of investments, right from seed stage, back in your village ventures days, all the way to now, late stage investments. Is it more true in a certain phase or a certain stage of the investment?
We do think it's more true at the early stage. We at Bain Capital Ventures, we continue to do seed and early. It's about half what we do, but half what we do is growth equity stage companies, often with more than 10 million in revenue, sometimes as much as 30 million in revenue. And when you're meeting a founder who's built a business to 30 million in revenue, a lot, the proof is kind of in the pudding at that point. You can acknowledge that she has a lot of positive attributes because just de facto, she's built a meaningful business already. And there's a lot of data in that. And so we often at the growth stage, spend much more time thinking about the business itself and leveraging our analytic toolkit to really understand its competitive positioning, quality of its financials, quality of its product, happiness of its customers, all the things that you can due diligence from the outside in. And we're both willing to stipulate that the management team is high quality in that they've demonstrated it. And also, the fact is, if you have a company with 30 million in revenue, say, and it's on its way to 50 and 70 and 90, if you need to make changes to the management team, generally speaking, hand in hand with the founder, who frequently will come to the board and say, I'm great up until 50 million in revenue, but we really need to hire an executive who can take this from 50 to 500. You can actually recruit that person. There are managers out there who know how to take a company from 50 to 500. That's not an act of invention usually. That's an act of executive leadership and management skills. And so you've got way more degrees of freedom when you're trying to recruit somebody into a scale business then when you're trying to swap out management, God forbid, you know, with $1 million in revenue, then the founder we find is just essential, irreplaceable usually.
Has there been, has there been more of, as you've seen founders start businesses and take them to that point where, it's obvious that it needs a manager who's not the founder. How often is it that that decision is not mutual versus it is something that is a difficult conversation? Is that something that happens often?
It hasn't happened as much lately. I think the whole sector of, entrepreneurial companies and the venture firms that serve them, there's been a lot of maturation in the past decade as the industry has scaled. And that's led to a couple things. One, on the part of investors, I have conversations, not frequently, but inevitably with founders where the conversation is not, hey buddy, we gotta make a change here. It's, hey Sarah, I think I'm seeing signs that you're losing the ability to fully manage this company. And here are the 4 or 5 data points, I point to. And so how are we going to address that? We can hire a chief operating officer or a president to solve some of the deficiencies that we're seeing. We can, if you don't have a coach already, you should have one. I think almost all of our founders utilize coaches, and we think that's essential. But the dialogue, from the venture capital side is much more consultative. It's just, hey, here's some objective facts that we're looking at. Where companies missed budget 3 quarters in a row, the company's NPS score is dipping, team morale is struggling in these areas. Like we're just seeing these signs, and so how do we address them? And then founders, I think, are more mature about this as well. I think there are enough examples of founders, from Bill Gates on down, who realized at a certain point that they were much more interested in and useful and excellent at the founding stage than at the scaling stage. And there's no shame in that. I think, it used to be stigmatized, and now I think it's celebrated to have a founder raise their hand and say, you know what, my work here, it's not done, but my contributions are much more leveraged as a chairman or a board member, or frankly going to start my next thing. So I think that it's an incredibly stressful topic, but it's way more constructive at this phase of the game and in the evolution of our asset class and our industry. And then the final thing I'll say is, we again at Bain Capital Ventures, and I think prevalent throughout the industry, is we really look to back founders where possible, where we think and they think they can go the distance. And so I've been doing this 25 years. In the first 5 or 10 years of my career, it was pretty common that you'd have founders who were, for instance, technical founders without any management experience, who were just not going to develop it on the job. And so you'd have lots and lots of hard conversations. And now that's not to take nothing away from technical founders. Technical founders are behind many of our greatest companies. But we have fewer conversations. I would say it's rare that these challenging conversations happen today at Bain Capital Ventures.
Right. I think that's a healthy sign that we have moved away from personality, big personality founders. And speaking of big personalities, I'm going to have my brand here as well, so that let's talk about brands. Let's talk about brands.
Good, beautiful.
Do you find?
Aditya, let me just say one more thing on this topic, because this is something that I think is often overlooked. Which is founders they bring unique things to the table. What we found is that when you replace a founder, you lose something. You lose an extra motivation. You lose a spark. You lose the thing that many of the employees were there for. You lose some element of courage frequently. The courage to reinvent the company often is something the founder has, because they took that initial risk. and a hired gun executive might not have. So I think it's more than just politeness that keeps us from wanting to replace founders. It's like this commercial instinct we have that founders bring a unique set of attributes to the table. I mean, you know, many founders, you know what I'm talking about, like that spark is irreplaceable. Now you can bring lots of other things when you bring on somebody who's scaled a business before, but it's always about pros and cons. Something is always lost in that transition.
Right. Is it easier for you now with a big brand behind you like Bain, as
literally behind me?
That one, yeah. Is it easier for you to now attract, you know, the best founders to invest in than 25 years ago? You think it makes a big difference for you as an investor?
I think it does. Just in a nutshell, I started at Bain Capital in 1995, and then in 2000 started a firm called Village Ventures with my partner Bo Peabody. And for 12 years, I ran that firm, and then 8 years ago came back to Bain Capital. And that transition definitely put some wind into my sails as an investor. I think not just the brand of Bain Capital, but the platform of Bain Capital. And when I sit with a founder and in a competitive situation and talk through what they get, what our value proposition is with a $100 billion asset management firm with a global presence and 200 multi-billion-dollar companies that we own who could be customers, and it's a more constructive conversation than, hey, I'm here from Village Ventures, and it's
right.
It's me and Bo and my golden retriever, and we're here to help. So I think about it. There's three things that founders are really buying when they buy our product. One is domain expertise. So I have 20 years in the saddle doing nothing but fintech, and for founders who want that, and it's not everybody who wants that. There's plenty of founders who are like, look, I can hire domain expertise. I can bring on an independent director who's a payments nerd. I don't need an investor who is one. But a lot of founders like going to board meetings and having an investor who doesn't have to be reminded, of what interchange means and all that stuff. And the second thing they're buying is just the interpersonal relationship. And I think this session, which one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be here with you, Aditya. The primary is just to see you again, but the second is that this founder-investor relationship is everything.
It's almost like a marriage, right? I mean, you have to make it work. I'm sure it's not. I mean, I don't think there's a playbook, Matt. Is there a playbook for the ideal marriage here? I mean, you probably have to figure out things as you go, right?
Yeah, I mean, every situation is. I've got 10 marriages going right now with 10 different founders, and every situation is fundamentally different, both the company situation and then more importantly, the psychological makeup of that founder. I think, I am who I am though. And I think that's what founders need to really evaluate when they're picking investors. Again, you have the domain expertise or lack thereof. You have the platform and the brand where the investor is sitting, and then you have the person. Mm-hmm. And you need to do your work on that. There's a lot of great people out there who work in investment firms who just aren't a fit for a given founder. So it's not just about nice person, not nice, or good character, not good character, although those things are really important. But it's also, as you point out, like a marriage, it's really about fit. What are their proclivities? What are their habits? How do they communicate? On what cadence? And do you like that? Because unlike a marriage, you can't just decide to get divorced. They've purchased the right to be on your board, and you gotta deal with that.
So I have heard founders complain and get frustrated, saying, I feel like I'm working for my board. I feel like I need to educate them. They don't get my business. I'm spending so much time just teaching them the basics. I wish I had more time to run the business than keep teaching my board members what this means. On the other hand, I have also seen founders pretty much give homework to their board members, give them assignments, get them to work for them. Who works for whom, Matt?
Well, I think 99% of the time the board works for the founder. Our view of venture capital is that we're in a service industry and the customer is the founder. There's that 1% of the time, or hopefully less, where the board has to act in its governance capacity as the boss of the founder. But much more generally, the board and the founder are working hand in hand in service of all shareholders. And the founder is the conductor of that orchestra. The founder is the one who calls the shots about who does what and who can bring what to the table and what those responsibilities need to be in that given moment. So this phenomena you point out about expertise and knowing the business is very, very common. Now, part of it can be solved again through choosing an investor who actually has a focus on your area. And so you aren't responsible for providing them all that background information over and over again. And hopefully in an ideal case, they actually see some stuff that you don't see because your head's down running the business, and maybe they've got a little more time to spend time with industry executives and be part of the MEDICI inner circle and actually inform themselves about what's going on and help you come up to speed. But I think founders need to have the swagger to understand that board members, well, again, in that fraction of a time when governance demands that they act as your boss, all the rest of the time, you're the conductor, they're the oboist, you need to direct the orchestra how to serve all shareholders. And that requires you to be quite assertive. Not obnoxious, but definitely assertive.
Is there an example from your experience of that 1%, where there's probably a teaching moment here that you want to share with founders who are listening to us?
I think we're that. So there's that less than 1% where we're talking about boards that need to remove founders, hopefully collaboratively, sometimes, unfortunately not. Again, I haven't personally seen that in the last decade or more in terms of companies I work with. But there's a lot, there's a greater incidence of cases where boards and founders disagree on something important. I would say the most frequent, to make it crisp, is regarding senior team members. Where you have this dynamic too many times to count, where a founder hired somebody early on, frequently somebody who had to step up and for the first time be the head of marketing or head of talent or chief revenue officer. That was their first time in that seat, and the company was $1 million in revenue at that point, and now the company's 20 million in revenue or 50 million in revenue, and that person's still in that seat. And the founder has an incredible loyalty to that person, not just because of interpersonal relationships, but because, by the way, they're the person who got them from 1 million to 50 million in revenue. Their whole experience with this individual is just extraordinary achievement. And so there's a gratitude, there's a loyalty, and there's also an impression that this may be the best marketing person ever, simply because in that founder's lived experience, that's the best marketing person they've ever seen. Whereas a lot of board members who've done this for a long time, who've seen companies scale well past 50 million in revenue, may have the perspective that actually that's not the best marketing person I've ever seen. And actually that's somebody who is awesome at 5 million, but is making it up every day right now and has no idea how to get from 50 to 500. And so that both of those are valid sets of beliefs and feelings. The founder is correct. That person is owed a massive debt of gratitude and loyalty and is an extraordinary performer. But the board member is correct that the company's not being well served by that person at this stage of the game, much less the next stage of the game. And so, those are some of the hard conversations where a board has to say to a founder, look, we don't control who your chief marketing officer is. You get to choose that. We don't have any levers. Somebody once said to me that, board members have no bullets. We only have bazookas. Like we can't do anything on the small stuff. We have one thing we can do, which is, performance manage the CEO. And so as it relates to their direct reports, all we can do is give our opinion. And so it's those, this is one of the things we look for in a partner at Bain Capital Ventures is the ability to be influential. Because the job there is not power. The job there is influence. How do you convince a founder with data, with persuasion, with examples, by setting them up in conversation with other founders, by introducing them to scale chief marketing officers so they know what excellent looks like. That whole toolkit of influence to try to get founders to make hard decisions sooner rather than later is where a lot of the sort of tense moments come in between founders and boards.
Right, right. I want to turn to the positives here, Matt. Because I have seen both the pros and the cons of not having raised institutional money for MEDICI, right? And there's days when I feel like maybe I should have. And we now have such, and like you're saying before, we have a good maturation in the ecosystems, right? Even in emerging markets, especially places like India, right, where you have seen the entire cycle of founders getting exits and then coming back into the investment world and becoming VCs. Is that a good thing? Is it naturally? Does having been a founder automatically make you a better investor? Is that a true thing?
I would say yes. I think all things equal, having founded a company and raised venture capital and dealt with venture capitalists on your board, all things equal makes you a better venture capital investor. And my sort of lightweight example of that is when I started Village Ventures, I had this in mind. And so I created a board of venture capitalists who actually invested money in the firm and in the fund. Yeah. And so Mark Donnelly from Bain Capital and Paul Mader from Highland, two legends in the industry, were my board directors for 8 years. And they kicked the shit out of me every quarter. And so I think what you learn from that, actually, most importantly, is empathy. Because nobody likes the lifelong investor, Wharton grad, lives in a spreadsheet, thinks he or she is God among men, hubris, never had to make a payroll. That person is not that useful to a founder, in my experience. If they haven't gone through the ringer of starting something from scratch, having a board of venture capitalists, and dealing with those quarterly board meetings from the founder seat, not just the board member seat. So I think that empathy is something that you can only learn through hard experience, and I benefit from it. And I think the other venture investors who I sit next to on boards, I can tell the difference from those who've done it and those who haven't. Now, I would distinguish that from operating experience. Operating experience can be a double-edged sword. So there are plenty of former operators, founders or non-founders, who have an incredible depth of knowledge about whatever it is, whatever industry they operated in and whatever discipline they came from. Yeah. And they can say things in board meetings that I could never say. Well, when I scaled a company from 100 to 300, here's exactly the challenges I faced, and I lived through it. And I can't say that. Village Ventures didn't scale from 100 to 300. So that's a superpower. But it's also, what, dude? You had one experience. Okay, for your company, from going 100 to 300, this is what you faced. Right. That may be relevant here or maybe not. But the thing is, the problem is for most operators, I don't want to say most, but for a lot of former operator turned investors, whatever they went through is the canon. And that's what every founder goes through. Right. And because it's their superpower, they lean on it way too much. So it's you know what, let's be a little more flexible here. Maybe in this particular case, splitting the job of CTO into VP Eng and architect is not a good idea, even though that's what you did and it worked for you. Maybe now it's not a good idea because the circumstances are incredibly different in this company. And so I think the dogmatism that certain former operators turned investors bring to the table based on their relatively limited but deep experience can be really painful for founders versus my experience is, I've been on the board of 100 companies and 30% of the time this works and 70% of the time this works. Let's look at the facts and circumstances and say, in your particular case, Sarah, what's the right answer for your company? So I think, there's plenty of operators who are open-minded, but the danger is the ones that believe that whatever they went through ends up being, canonically the right answer. The other thing I'll say for you, Aditya, for bootstrapped companies who've scaled without outside investors is, the product I'm selling is a bundle. It is a brand. It is my own personal services as an advisor to the company and my network, and it's money. Like, there's a set of things that you get when you buy my product. You can buy those separately. You can buy the network through independent board members and advisors. You can buy the guidance and oversight through, again, independent directors. It's hard to get the money separately. You can get it in debt and other things that, but you can disaggregate the venture product and get what you need. I talk to a lot of bootstrap founders who don't need the money or have decided not to take it. And I always recommend to them, like, think about what you're giving up and then go buy that separately. You don't have to take it as a bundle if you don't want.
I mean, look, I think you covered so much ground in the last 7 minutes here. I think people should rewind and listen to this slowly because you covered a lot of ground. Since I met you the first time, I think 2008 or something like that, it was a really long time ago. And, as you've grown through the ecosystem and have now become the preeminent VC investor, I should say the fintech investor, and the world has changed a few times, or some things haven't changed. I feel like, something about you that hasn't changed is just how thoughtful you are. Now, the fact that you have this radio voice made you an attractive first guest. But just the way you have always approached, in a very thoughtful way, looking at things. Is that a reflection of who you are? Is the brand of Matt Harris the same as the real Matt Harris, or are you actually an impulsive guy inside?
But, I have 6 little kids, and I was just wrangling them all by myself. And I think they might say there's another Matt Harris that occasionally they get to see, who's somewhat short-tempered and impulsive. But I think, I'll give you a little anecdote. So you mentioned a radio voice. Well, my brother, slightly older brother, is actually a TV personality. Okay. And he hosts Good Morning America at ABC. And he became a Buddhist 7 or 8 years ago. And he now spends a big chunk of his time running a company called 10% Happier, which is his brand. And for him, mindfulness and in particular meditation, an hour a day, is a necessary thing to separate himself from the emotional turmoil that a lot of people deal with, frankly, that everyone deals with. The crazy things that your brain tells you to do. And my read on that is I've been very lucky in that score. I do meditate, but I was sort of born with this ability to observe my own emotions. And I'm doing this with you, Aditya. Like, there's a little bit of nerves, right? There's a lot of people watching, and it gets recorded and it lives forever. And I need to be thoughtful about how I come across. But I can see the nervousness in my head. I can see that little worm of nervousness, and I can tell it to behave. And I can carry on without letting that nervousness dominate my affect or what I say and how I react. And the same is true for emotions like anger, jealousy, insecurity, and a lot of the emotions that plague me, just like they plague everybody else. And so I counsel founders on this topic, this topic of attachment. You're incredibly attached to your company and to its economic success and to your employees and all of these incredibly loaded topics. And you need to be. You need to harness that as motivation. But you also need to be able to separate yourself. You need to be able to manage that attachment so that from time to time you can be clinical and make really hard decisions that are more dispassionate and let you respond to things versus just react to things. So I think this is me. There are other facets of me that I'm less proud of, moments when I am dominated by my attachments and less Buddhist than I aspire to be. But I think that knowledge of the battle we're all fighting gets you half the way there. just acknowledging that our brains are not our friend all the time. And we need to think hard about how to control those emotions, not stifle them, but just acknowledge them and then don't let them be the boss.
That's really, really important. And thank you so much for sharing that so candidly with us, Matt, because, most people don't come out of the typical, the box of what it is to be a VC, right? And you mentioned kind of the Ivy League, right? The Ivy League degree and the blue blazer and the traditional caricature that you have of a VC. Well, the human being inside is what is truly driving both the business from a founder's perspective and the investment from the VC's perspective, right? And I think that human emotion, I think you said it so well. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. We are in difficult times, right? Yes. This is not an easy time to run a business. We all have to make hard decisions, in our families, in our careers as founders and CEOs. We have to make decisions about managing cash and, employees and, how do you pay your bills and it is not an easy time. And I think what you just said, Matt, is something that should really help us as we reflect upon, that ability for us to dissociate, right, the objective as kind of a Excel-driven business versus what is it that I need to do, right? And what truly is the need of the hour for me, the company, the employees, the business. It's not easy. It's not easy. No. I know we could talk forever. I want to end with something that we are doing for these special times, but before I do that, Matt, and before I let you go, is there anything that you want to share with those listening and who will listen to this and see this that I might not have asked you that you want to share with us?
Yeah, there are two, like every saying, there's two sort of somewhat trite things that are trite because they're sayings, but also incredibly meaningful and worth studying. First is, one of my favorite books is Dune. I'm a science fiction nerd, like probably many of you. And, this right now in particular, I feel like reminding all of my founders that fear is the mind killer, because you can't help but be afraid right now. You're not just afraid for your business, you're afraid for your own health and your family's health and the state of the world and our society and how divided we are. And there's a long list of things that biologically are going to produce fear in us. And you need to be able to reset and put that fear aside and acknowledge it and not let it dominate your thinking. You may have to make hard decisions, really hard decisions, because you anticipate really negative things, but that's different than being afraid of those things. Acknowledging those things as truths and as highly probable outcomes is important. That's just good management, good leadership, but don't let yourself be afraid if you can. And then the second thing, this is a goofy expression, but it's so valuable, is, no news is bad news is good news, and good news is no news. And this is what, as an investor, if you think about my seat, I sit around and wait for founders to get in touch with me, because the last thing founders need is for me harassing them. Hey, what's going on? What's happening? What's happening with this? What's happening with that? So I generally let founders set that cadence. And this is what goes through my head. When I don't hear from them, I assume it's bad news. No news is almost always bad news if they're being quiet. If they give me bad news, that's fantastic. Okay, great. We've identified the problem. Let's go solve it. Let's go nail this thing. We now know what the issue is. That is 70% of the battle. That is good news. Thank you for sharing that bad news with me. Let's figure it out. And then when they call me with good news, I just sort of like, okay, can we get through this? Like, I'm sure good things are happening. I don't need to know that. I'm here for the bad news. I'm the bad news guy. I'm here to help you solve problems. You want to celebrate with me? That's fine. We can do that. But let's get through that. And then let's talk about our problems, because that's my job. And so as a founder, like, you don't know when to communicate. You don't always know how to communicate. Just try to remember that that's what your investor's thinking about.
Matt, this is fantastic. I truly feel I'm a little bit wiser after the last 30 minutes. So Thank you again. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you everybody for listening in our weekend wisdom series. Matt Harris of Bain Capital Ventures, I really appreciate you doing this. I want to end with just a quick pitch for a COVID-19 fund that we have launched. All of us are fortunate here to have these conversations, to work from home, to think about the future, have hope for when things get back to normal. Many people do not have this hope. So we, as small as we might be, we are committed to serving the communities in the markets that we play in. We are collecting donations. Go to gomedici.com/donate. And we will be contributing 100% of the donations that come in towards solo and small volunteers who are doing work on the ground. So please take a moment, gomedici.com/donate. Once again, thank you, Matt, and thank you, everybody. This is Medici Inner Circle Live.